to the third tone and the beginning of the Ajna binary. In the statistical research that is being done by Ray of Life Sciences, we come across some hilarious things. And one of my favorite jokes, one of my best jokes so far, is a statistical study of the significance of centers in the nine-centered matrix. I don't want to go into the technical description of how that works. Basically what it is to find out initially if there are any centers that have no significance. Then of course the whole matrix breaks down. Then to be able to see the graduated differences between significance. In other words, which centers are more significant than others. So we discovered that all of them are significant. That is, as we did with type, the nine-centered matrix stands up. But what was so fascinating was that on a scale of significance, the least significant center was the Ajna. By the way, the real joke is that when we did the same analysis on the dream rave, that in the dream rave where you may know that in our dreaming state, that's when we're totally involved in the non-personal. And in the dream rave, of course, the center that's the least significant is the G. So in dealing with the Ajna center, you know, it's one of these things, it's the great joke of what it is to be a human being. Here we are, you know, and here we have this wonderful mechanism, this mind of ours, but it is the least significant. It does not have inner authority. It is not going to be able to tell us what is correct for us to do, not do, all of those things. However, it is about us having the ability to store and communicate with each other the experience of existence. I mean, that is what it's about. You know, mind is there so that we can communicate, that we can interact, and that we can hold ourselves together as a whole. Because that's our main mechanism for holding ourselves together, is that through mind and through the collective mind, we are able to establish what is and what isn't the world. And you'll notice that when you get into the mind, you have nothing but the collective. You know, that's one of the things that separates the tribe from the collective so profoundly. I mean, the tribe is not into the mental trip. It's not what they're about. And of course, the collective is entirely into the mental trip. That's what they are about. You know. I have an old farmer friend of mine, shepherd in Ibiza. And whenever the moon was full, he would pump water. And I thought, geez, Antonio, you smart guy. You know, the moon's full. It takes less energy to pull the water up. You know, a good collective, logical concept. And I go over, I see him a couple of days down the road. I said, Antonio, I said, that's great. I said, I notice you're always pumping your water when the moon is full. He said, really? I mean, what the hell does the tribe care? You know. I mean, he knows when to pump his water. It's, you know, it's not a concept. It's not built on some logical calendar. It's not a, you know, it's not a matter of physics. You know, it's just operating through him. I'd tell another story, but this is on tape, and I wouldn't tell that story about him on tape. Anyway. Yeah, right. We'll wait till the break. Okay, so we've got the Ajna binary. The first thing I want you to notice about this Ajna binary is that the third tone is related to the logical process, and the fourth tone is related to the abstract process. That's the first thing to recognize in terms of looking at streams and understanding the way the streams work relative to the sense. Here you can see that the sense is the eyes. And we are talking about the visual, but of course we are talking about two different ways in which the visual operates. We have outer vision and we have inner vision. The 17th gate, the gate of the right eye, is the eye that looks outward. and I'm speaking of that at a genetic level, that the 11th gate, that the gate of ideas, is the eye that looks inward. Now, these are metaphors, and I'll talk about the process as we go through. But the important thing to recognize about this department is that this department is very different because obviously, given the insignificance of the ajna, it has absolutely nothing to do with our survival. There's nothing to do with our survival. It isn't anything that's going to make us secure or insecure. It isn't about having enough to eat. It isn't about any of those things. It's about what to do and what not to do. The basic morality of the mind. Oh, we're touching something deep to all of us here, eh? This is the basic morality of the mind. To do or not to do. Now, the assumption is that the mind is in charge of that duality. We can do what we want to do. We do not have to do what we don't want to do. And so forth and so on. But that's the mind. It's the whole thing that the mind is busy with. Do we do? What do we do? And when do we do it? And can we do it now? Do we have to wait? I don't want to wait. I want to do it. What do I do while I'm waiting to do? Is there something to do while I'm waiting to do, or do I die? You know, the mind is only occupied with doing. It isn't occupied with anything else. And everybody wonders why their mind runs their lives and they're so unhappy. It doesn't know what to do. It wants to do. It will make up anything. And while it's making it up, it doesn't recognize that it's being conditioned by the chemistry that's prevalent in the body at the moment. That mind just takes the chemistry of the moment. So this is all about the curse of mind. The third tone. The right eye is always looking at the world of patterns. Always. The right eye sees everything as a pattern first. The right eye is sort of like a living cubist painting. It's always breaking up the landscape. It's always breaking up the world into patterns. When it looks at a human being, it might see eyes or breasts or shoulders or elbows, or it doesn't see the whole being together as one. It doesn't. It just sees patterns. And it is those patterns that it cues to, that it sees. And what it's looking for in the cueing to those patterns is how it can be safe to take action, or what way to take action, or where to take action. If you're going to be a boxer, good to have a good right eye. You see the places, you see the pattern, you see the spots. This is the whole thing about the way in which the right eye operates. And because it's always looking at the patterns, it's always preparing for action in that way. I can take action. I know the pattern. Here's the pattern. I'll follow the pattern. The pattern's secure. I know it's secure. Away you go. See, this is how the logical mind seduces somebody into taking action when in fact they may not have any right whatsoever to take that action. And the way in which it seduces us is it says to us, look, it's logical. Come on, dummy, it's logical. 1 and 1 equals 2. Go ahead, do it. Just do it. Yeah. I've always tried to find a way to properly insult the mind and put it in its right place, you know? And the mind, I've always reminded you, is this little corporal in the research department that wants to be dictator. And it's amazing how many people allow, you know, this uncontrollable, weird thing, you know, to become the dictator and the controller of their lives. And human beings do it all the time. And of course, because the mind at the genetic level is only interested in what to do or not to do, in other words, the morality of being involved in life, that our minds naturally jump from that and take the assumption that because we dwell on it, it is what we're about. You know, I think, therefore I am. And other stuff like that. We're also going to see that in looking at the Ajna binary, we're dealing with two very different aspects of the collective process. Now, one of the things that's interesting statistically in our research is that there's very little significance between the abstract and the logic. Very little. In other words, they are not simply mirrors of each other, but they are complementary mirrors of each other. Yet it is only the logic for us that can be reliable. Because the logic being rooted in its pattern will be reliable because it means that it can be authenticated in the same way by somebody else. That's why when you do research, anything that you research has to be duplicated by any other independent body. It's the way in which logic assures us that it's legitimate. But of course, you don't have that with the abstract. It's not possible with the abstract process. There is no pattern, and there is no logic. There is simply what appears to be the chaos and flow of things. Now, that's a very different kind of vision. And it says something interesting about the way in which mind works is that the inner vision is chaotic and the outer vision is seeking order. You know, this is what we're doing all the time. We're moving from the chaos to the order. Now, remember something about our eyes. We always assume that our eyes are watching and taking in. But our eyes are creating each instant. We recreate the world each instant through our eyes. After all, you know, we see what we're conditioned to see. And we give it the names we've been conditioned to give it. And because everybody agrees to that, you know, that this is a room and we're people, you know, then everybody's comfortable because that's a nice secure pattern for us all. But the mind on the inside is chaotic. It's a place in which things can come into form. But it's only when it comes out, only when you see it in the world, that it can take on its real value. So you have a prana here between the inner and the outer vision. And that's a prana that's operating between the logical and the abstract processes, which are very different in the way they operate, but have the same goal in common. That goal is to assure us that we can continue to live on this planet. The abstract being will leap into the experience and let us know that we can do it too. It's survivable. We can make it. The logical will propagandize us with a proven pattern and assure us that it'll work, and we go along with it. You know, they're both trying to let us know it's okay, we're going to be all right here. So far, so good. Everything's all right. Let's have a break. Antonio, you've been kept off the tape. Let's return to the ajna and let's start looking at the third tone and look at it in some detail. We're going to begin with this process of outer vision. Let's start at the beginning of the logical mental process. If you start at the beginning, first of all, by the way, mind, you know, any stream that's operating in the mind is a projected stream. We already know by the rules of mechanics that anything projected is going to have to be recognized. So mind in and of itself is not there to initiate. You know, it's there to be recognized, and then of course it can share out of that recognition. Outer vision. There's two different aspects of this. One is the vision to be able to see the pattern without it being there. Another vision is as visionary. And also the outer vision in the sense that you are seeing the patterns. Now, every part of the mind that's taking in pattern is always questioning, because that's the pressure that we get from the 63rd gate. In other words, we can never escape the fact that our whole mental processes are under enormous pressure. So we're going to be under pressure to be able to see the patterns, but at the same time we're under pressure to visualize the patterns. In other words, to project into the future. Everything about the success of propaganda is about what it will do for you in the future. It's not about what it'll do for you today. It's about what it'll do for you in the future. This is a projection. This is moving you safely in space, saying you're going to be able to go from A to B and everything's going to be terrific. Now, what we know about the 63rd gate as a gate of doubt at the mundane level of our lives is that this is about questioning, and it means that the uncertainty principle that we met in the second tone, that this is the next level of it. In other words, that there is always doubt that one is seeing what one is seeing. I mean, there's always doubt that what you're seeing isn't really what you're seeing. And we have all kinds of expressions for that. Well, no, you didn't really see it. You didn't get the whole picture. And built into us is there's a question in us, is what we did not see more important than what we did see? We can never escape morality in the collective. And of course, so much of the way in which we question is rooted in the morality. In other words, something that feels good to us is rarely questioned. Something that feels bad to us is questioned. So the doubt that starts our whole process tells us a lot about us genetically, that until we get to a point where we can give something a name, we doubt that we can really see it. That's why they always have difficulty at lineups. You know, if there's a crime, somebody does something and you're in a room, it doesn't really mean that you're going to be able to recognize those people. It doesn't. They don't have a name for you. They don't have a name. It's one of the amazing things about seeing is that you need to be able to put a name to what you see. That's the whole logic business. I mean, after all, that's the way in which we have built our collective intelligence. The more names we can give, like taste, you know, the more variety that we get, the more names that we have, the more sophisticated we become, the more variables we have to look at. You know, that's why it seems that as we get more and more and more sophisticated, it seems like it may be harder and harder and harder to come up with a simple truth. I know that's not true. However, you know, the need for perfection and the driving force behind the logical process means the doubt is sought wherever it can be. It's an endless process of questioning. Endless process of questioning. It doesn't stop. And as long as we're going to be in those forms, it doesn't stop. I mean, we can never give up doubting. Never, 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 never. Doubt so ye may be free. Something like that. You know, never, never, never give up your doubt. Now, not being a 63, I can really say that. You know, that's not speaking out of my design. You know, I don't want to live a life of doubting the human design system. I'm not designed for that. But it's something to recognize how important doubt is. The questions are so important. When you get to the fourth gate, you see that it all changes. The answer is important. You know, don't give me the questions, but the answers are important. And of course, genetically, we're designed to come up with answers all the time. We have to be able to moment by moment, second by second, confirm to ourselves that we are in a reliable pattern. Constantly. I mean, we all know that. If somebody was to go into each and every one of our houses today, and without our knowledge, remove one thing, we would notice. I mean, sooner or later, you're going to notice. You know, we need our patterns. And even while you're not noticing, you're uncomfortable. Reliability for us as human beings is very important for us. You know, so we have our names and we have our numbers and we have our addresses and we have all these fixed patterns that assure us that we know where we live, you know, what the day of the week is. All of those little answers, they're all necessary for us, and it means that at the genetic level, that's really obsessive. I mean, logical people are really obsessed. I mean, it may not show in their personality. It depends on their design and how it operates. But the fact is that there's always this, okay, the pattern, you know, where's the pattern? What's the pattern? What's the pattern? You know, does this work? You know, is this the answer? You mean it's not? Where's the answer? You know, let me find the answer. On and on and on. I mean, logic is as much a seeker as the abstract. It just seeks differently. You know, and it seeks the security of the pattern. That's what it cares about. But look, it's outer vision. And because it's outer vision, it really isn't personal. And this is where people at the mundane level really get messed up. It's not about questioning their lives. It's not about having to come up with an answer for what they have to do in life. Remember that if you see the mind for what it is simply an outer authority for others. In other words, it's the ability to be able to express whatever the questions and answers happen to be that are floating around in the program. It isn't about anything else, and it certainly isn't personal. The moment it's personal, you know, everything in your life falls apart when you take it personal. Because the moment you take it personal, you take it in, and you cannot erase that. You cannot get rid of that. You identify with it. You attach yourself to it. And then it becomes so important. I mean, it just becomes important, and everybody runs around with, you know, all this weight and all this energy and all this stuff that they carry around. It's the most difficult thing for the collective to grasp about itself, particularly people who are strongly collective. It's difficult to recognize that that is part of them or them, and that for them to see that it's not personal. Now, they cannot take it personal, because if you are logical and you take it personal, you are always your worst enemy. Always. Because you hold yourself up to the same standards as everything else, and nothing is perfect. And you punish yourself against that standard. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to study more. I'm going to be better. It's not the fault of the genes that we take that personal. It's our lack of awareness. After all, it's necessary for us to be secure in whatever patterns are available as long as they're available. It's absolutely essential. The other thing is that we're really not discussing here about the nature of the perfected process is that it does improve. I mean, that's the whole thing about logic. The whole thing about logic is that once you apply an organized system, then you can begin to improve upon that system. I'm a better educator today than I was 13 years ago when I started in my process. There is an improvement that takes place. The telephone that hooked us up, you know, at the turn of the century is a very different communication device today. In other words, there are improvements that take place, but there's no perfection in that. And yet being involved in the reconfirmation process all the time adds improvements to the basic pattern that's there. So genetically, it's a very important instrument for us. It's not about just saying, look, you got to be organized. It's about saying that by being organized, you have to become more efficient. This is the efficiency department. I belong to the efficiency department. You know, this is where I am in the Department of Planning. I want you to be organized. I want you to have an answer. I want you to be much more efficient as objects moving in space. Most of you are just creating a lot of drag, and there's wear and tear on you psychically and physically, and you'll probably end up dead before you get it. However, that was for most of the people on tape. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Is that okay? However, it's my last course. And I don't need you anymore after this. And I could get real nasty. It's about establishing an outer view. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of the third tone, is to be able to establish an outer view, to be able to establish a vision based on a pattern. And that when the third tone can get to that place where it can have the pattern and establish and share the vision, then it's successful. But that's not the end of the process. The moment that you bring a pattern, the pattern then has to live out its logical life, which means it constantly has to be tested. Constantly. Over and over and over and over and over again. It's got to go through that process. And each time that it goes through that process, everybody becomes more and more relaxed with the fact that that's the way that it works. Just because there is subjective approval for human design doesn't mean that that's a place where it can stop. It can't, because it's a logical system. In other words, it's got to go through the scrutiny, it's got to go through the testing, it's got to go through the research. It doesn't matter subjectively that I can change your life in 40 minutes sitting beside you. That's not the point. That'll never be sufficient for the logic system. Logic has to see that what may be a mutation is in fact based on a pattern that can be acceptable to the collective. And then they will go through their whole collective process with it. And by the way, the moment that they take it, it's different than where it was at the beginning, because it goes through its own evolutionary improvement process. Right? I mean, there are other people that teach people design in terms of being professionals and analysts. They teach them better than I do, because that's not my job. In other words, there's a process that takes place in which there is a natural evolution, there's a natural improvement, but it constantly has to be verified. So what the third tone is trying to do is that it looks out at the patterns, because that's one aspect of its function, to be one of the rods, to take in certain amounts of information. Everything that it's taking in, it's questioning. Everything. Remember that. Everything that's taken in is questioned. It doesn't mean you're doing that consciously. Every pattern that you're taking in is questioned. If you're really aware as a logical visionary in that sense, you can go home after taking a drive and suddenly remember that there was a sign that was once somewhere that wasn't there anymore. There's a way of recognizing the pattern in real detail, because the moment that you can see that pattern, that's the moment you can build on it, and you can begin your process of trying to imagine, to be the visionary that can go beyond that and see where the pattern will actually lead to. Now, it's funny, in my own nature, I don't like to do that. Anybody who knows me intimately, who wants to engage me in talking about the future of human design, finds that I'm enormously resistant. I'm too much the individual and the existentialist. Let's just see what design is like today. Yet there is a part of me, because I carry the third tone, there's a part of me that can never escape that. There's a part of me that can always see, based on the pattern as I see it, where that pattern is going, what its pace is, all of those things, because it's part of the way in which outer vision operates. Now that says something very interesting about the importance of stimulation. You know my concern about children, my love of children. And one of the things so interesting is the studies that have been done on the developmental capacities of children that are highly stimulated in their early years, first 3 years of life, and those children that don't get a lot of stimulation. In other words, a lot of people talking to them, reading to them, showing them things, bright colors, all of these various things. this is such an important attribute, this stimulation field. And of course, what's happening is that with the questioning capacity and the ability to see patterns, that the earlier the patterns and the stimulation process starts, the better off it is for the children. In other words, it's going to enrich their capacity to have much greater questions in their life and much more important answers in that sense to find. Again, you can see that poverty, both intellectual and physical poverty, is one of the great curses of this planet. I mean, it's one of the great curses of this planet. Because, of course, along with that poverty comes the diminished resources at the mundane level, which means that you don't get the expansive diet, so you don't get the broad judgmental capacity. In other words, to see enough variations to be able to have a more solid kind of judgment, and you don't get the same kind of intellectual stimulation. You don't have the same kinds of early patterns that get you processing those patterns and get you to start working on the question and answer process. In other words, poverty is going to eliminate many opportunities in the gene pool. That's why we have such ready violence in the world amongst those that are disenfranchised and poor. Because you see, their genetic line is being strangled off. They're being limited to less and less and less of what the world consciousness really is. In other words, the broader field of judgment, the broader field of recognizing an answer. Remember, if you have a limited field of perception, you may not grasp larger questions at all. Now, you're only going to be limited to a specific, and it's chemistry, guys and gals. It's chemistry. It's about what you get to eat. It's the toys you get to play with. I mean, it's something very important to understand. You see, we've, what I call retros. The world's filled with retros, That is, those people that want to go back to the farm and back to the primitive way and, the fundamentalist movements, all of these things. I can understand the basic resistance to the collective future, if the collective is to rule. However, they are taking us in that direction. And we're not going to escape it because, after all, logic does know the way. I mean, until there's mutation, there isn't anything else you're going to be able to trust but logic. That the collective program as it operates today, it's taking us in the right direction. But what it means is that unless we have equability amongst all of the various tribal groups so that they all get access, they're not going to have the same kind of opportunities, and they're going to be limited, which means that the collective is going to be dictated by only first world nations. Which, of course, is the case today. The first world is dictating the flavor of what the collective happens to be. And that also means that is the propaganda layer, if you will, that is pointing towards our future. I mean, they're all pointing, those that are in control at the top of the hierarchy, they're the ones that have the broadest amount of stimulation. They're the ones who have the most questions and answers on their plate. They're the ones that are telling us where the direction happens to be. Everybody's got to get on board that wagon. Now, of course, what they do is that they try to get us to go along with them. And one of the ways that they do that, of course, is by enslaving us into the modern bureaucracy and into the modern social systems. The moment that you have a social security number, they've got you at some level or another. So this outer vision has to be seen in two ways. That is, because it's moralistic, you've got two ways in which it works as a polarity. The first way is, let's call it the positive. Let's be nice. The positive way is that there are legitimate questions that can have valid answers, that can bring genuine improvement to society. And that the real task after that is to be able to be reasonable enough to get society to identify with it and go along with it. That's very positive. No question about that. However, the collective can also, and it always will, that the moment that you have somebody that can present that positive argument, you will see that instantaneously you have the devil's advocate who's going to be able to present exactly the opposite argument. Exactly opposite. It's like the story of Venus, right? I mean, the scientists can't figure Venus out. It flips them out, eh? You know, for example, on Venus, there's a mountain range that's 25 miles high. And it's been 25 miles high for 600 million years. Now here, we cannot imagine that. How the hell is that possible? There, you know, there's an atmosphere there. There's all those things there. You know, why is it that that mountain range can stay the same height for 600 million years? I mean, no mountain range on Earth stays the same height. It's constantly either being pushed up or being eroded downward. So you have all these scientists on either side, and they all have these splendid computer-animated, verified, blah, blah, blah theories of theirs that are exactly opposite each other. They found out something incredible. The planet's dead. And what happens to it is that 600,000 years ago, the whole surface of the planet collapses into its boiling hot center and then reforms and starts again. So right now, it's dead. You know, at any given time, the whole planet, the whole surface of the planet collapses into itself. Everything is fresh and it starts all over again. When they finally figured that out because they took meteor impact images of the planet and dated it. And what they discovered is they're all the same age. I mean, it happened at the same time and then everything died. Nothing changes. Nothing's different. 600 million years. Same movie on the surface. Collapse underneath. But my point is the scientists. You're always going to have these two sides. So one of the things to recognize about the negative application of the collective is that it is a positive contribution. The whole thing about the collective is it's not tribal. It does not allow itself to be placed under the thumb of authority. And so there's always going to be a place in the collective for negative challenge. Now, of course, what infuriates us is when that negative challenge is applied to something that appears to be viable, useful. You know, that's when we feel like that kind of challenge is an uncomfortable thing. But recognize genetically what that means for us. We're meant to be argumentative creatures. There's so many people in my life who don't like to argue. You know, they don't like to fight, what they call fighting or squabbling or, you know, this or that. It's a very, very important part of being. I mean, it is essential to the logical way. It's absolutely essential. I mean, even if you want to agree with somebody logically, argue with them first. It brings out the best of the logic or shows you that it's weak. You see, we're meant to be that way, but of course you can only be that way if you don't take it personal. It's collective. It's just sharing. And if you don't have to do anything about it. The fact that somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean that turns into hitting them. It doesn't have to become an action. But you see, we run away from that because we've got a whole psychological trip with all of that. But the fact of the matter is, it's incredibly valuable to us from the logical point of view. From the logical point of view, nobody should be able to say, this is it. And everybody is there going, yeah, right. Yeah, that's it. See, this is what the collective detests in the tribe. The sheep mentality. Eh? I mean, the collective want to condition you to be sheep. That's different. Natural sheep is what they don't like. You know, it's like, nah, they'll follow any duck. And of course, in the collective, that's never there. There's always in the collective, you always have to carry your armor. Always. Because there's always somebody who's going to take a poke at you. And it doesn't matter who you are, nor what position of authority you're in. And of course, if you don't allow that to happen collectively, what you get is assassination. Kill them. If they don't let us challenge them legitimately, we get rid of them. The collective is very interesting. So the whole thing to understand about the collective mind is that the collective mind is here to argue. Now, I was very fortunate. I grew up with a right-wing intelligent father. And of course, that was great fun growing up. And everything was an argument. Everything. And it bothered everybody in my family. It didn't bother me. I loved it. It was great fun to watch them turn red. It was one of those things where it was like, but the whole thing out of that, I learned a lot out of that. I was growing, I wasn't, my logic wasn't necessarily consistently right. So I got put in my place a few times. That was great. And you don't know until you open that up. It's a very beautiful thing. Now, of course, in this country, you have lawyers. And I guess you got so many, they do it for you, and you forget. But again, really, it's so important to understand that argumentation, going back and forth, going through that process, if you don't take it personal, if it's not emotionalized, if it's not a question of ego and your identity and all of these things, then you'll see how beautiful it is. Because it's the way it's meant to work. The whole Socratic, blah, 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 all of this stuff. It really is something that is a boon to proper intellectual development. And it's one of the things that we don't have anymore, other than debating societies or things like that. We don't encourage that kind of confrontation because people are just too insecure. There's too many other things. They're not self-life. They're hating themselves. Their lack of adequacy, all of that stuff that, they don't want to deal with those things, even though they're worthy and should be, could be, might be, using their language, dealt with and be productive as such. That leads to the 17th gate, and it leads to the symbol of the right eye. The 17th gate is the gate of opinion. Now, the 17th gate, like the 11th gate, these are gates of teaching. But they are gates of teaching, which means that they are first gates of being students. And it's very important for them both, in that sense, to understand that process. In other words, that first they have to learn and then they can teach. They're not going to get it the other way around, which means that it takes time in their process. That 17th gate of opinion, genetically, there is something unusual in this gate because this gate has problems with time. It's one of the most consistent things you'll find with the 17th gate is that it doesn't really know how long things take or how quick they take. And it is not going to have a successful judgment when it comes to the timing of things. Now think about that. That's where the opinion is being established as to how the pattern can be seen in the future. If that doesn't make you nervous. We all know that, eh? If you grew up in the post-war era, in the 60s, it was very common to have magazine articles and a whole set of science fiction genre that was going to tell you what 2000 was going to look like. Now, those were all 17s. You just know that. We don't have all the things that they assumed that we were going to get. And it's not that we may not get them. Beam me aboard, Scotty, and all that nonsense. It doesn't mean we may not get them, but the timing is really off. It's really off. 2000 really doesn't look all that different from 1960. We don't have all these flying things and blah, blah, blah. We don't have the, cities on the moon and, all of these things that were predicted and the household gadgets. There's a case I'm going to miss. The only thing I'm going to miss in America, I'm truly going to miss in America, aside from you, of course, I don't want to upset you. The only thing I'm going to miss in America is my electric garage and the weird cable stations. That's America. It really is, you know? And the cable stations, you get to see the bizarrest stuff on these cable stations. The things they sell and the way they try to sell them, all of this stuff. Anyway, I don't want to get into it. It's too much. Outer vision. 17th gate, you know, when you're dealing with the 17th gate, you got to see that, look, if their timing is off, you know, how many presidential candidates say, you know, not in my term will I increase taxes? Now, you know they don't want to. I mean, it's bad politics. But they got the timing off. You know? Or you can call them a liar, whichever you prefer. There's always going to be difficulty with the timing, which is why you have to be very, very careful about somebody who says, as people do to me all the time, well, the pattern's great. I mean, within moments, everybody's going to know. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But your timing, your timing's off. Be wary of logical people making time promises. Now, one of the things about that is that if it wasn't for the distortion in the time in the 17, we really wouldn't be racing along as fast as we're doing. I mean, not being able to grasp the time properly always makes us feel even more inadequate and pushes us even faster to try to make up for the lost time. You know, well, I'm going to stay with it. You know, I thought I'd have it done in 2 years, but I'm going to stay with it. You know. What's so interesting about the way in which the distortion of time operates is that it means that you cannot accept that the pattern they claim that is reliable now will really be reliable in the future. You can't trust them. That's why you have to have people all the time testing and checking and letting you know on a regular basis that it's all okay. Because you cannot accept the promise. They don't have the timing right. You know, it was like these people that were building roads in cities in America in the 60s and said, you know, that they could handle cars for the next 50 or 60 years. Only to realize that, you know, they just didn't get that. You know, they didn't get their timing right. So there's always this distortion that's there, but the distortion is there to make us feel inadequate so that we'll work harder. Which is great. The 60-second gate is a metamorphic gate, and as such, the genetic material that's here in the third tone is very important. That is, this is the ability to be able to transform frequency into recognizable patterns. To transform frequency into recognizable patterns that can be repeated as recognizable patterns. That's language. That's the gift of the 60-second gate. It takes a frequency, and it takes that frequency, and it frames it in a pattern. Now, the way it does that is that it gives it a name. And by framing it in that pattern can then be repeated. Some of the various early names were the sounds themselves. You know, there's many tribes on Earth. I was reading an article about some Inuit tribe in Alaska, and the names for its various birds are the sounds that the birds make. That is the human version of them. So one of the things that the 60-second gate does is that it makes us possible to be able to concretize the Maya. And we concretize the Maya through names. By being able to set the pattern, that it's not enough to set the pattern. There's always this joke about the secret name. You ever get the joke of that? A secret name doesn't exist. It has no power. It has no power. You know, if there's a name and you're only holding it within yourself, it has no power. And so many people have been looking for secret names. You know, the names of power. It's a real joke. The moment that something has a name, oh boy, then it has power. So the way in which we concretize the Maya is that we take a frequency, we put that frequency into a fixed pattern, and then we identify that pattern with a name. And the moment that we do that, that's the moment we've got to propagandize that. In other words, we've got to get that to somebody else. We've got to share that with somebody else. And when they go, you go and say, no, tree. And the moment they get it, that's the moment that you have brought them into the collective in that sense. That's the moment that you formed a common bond with them, and that common bond is through the name. And of course, because we're dealing here with the throat, we're dealing here with speech, and we're dealing with the acoustic phenomena that holds all of these tones together, we're dealing with the magic of the word. I don't know how many of you have the experience of speaking more than one language. And I've always enjoyed speaking many languages because I've always enjoyed the impact on my vanity. When you first learn a language, because your vocabulary is so limited, you're really dumb. No matter how intelligent you are inside. I can remember when I first started to speak German, I felt like a 2-year-old. You're limited by the formulas that you can use. You're just limited by them. Your ability to be able to grasp concepts. Here I am, an intelligent man, and all I can do is, pay for something because they can tell me how much it costs. But, I don't know what the hell's going on. And I watch because I have many languages and I speak each of them at different levels of proficiency, and my intelligence is relative. It's relative to the magic that I have in the stored formulas that I can use. I can describe myself, I can describe a concept, I can get my message across much more efficiently the more magic I have as a tool. So one of the things to recognize about the whole process of outer vision is that outer vision is about telling everybody what you see. And if they don't giving it a name so that they can see it like you see it. And if you can see the same things together, you form a unique bond. I'm so looking forward to this summer in the retreat that I'll be having in Spain. Because I go back to having my cosmopolitan classroom. And it's fascinating. Because all of those people, whether they can speak to each other or not, whether they share the same language or not, they can look at the body graph. And that through the body graph, they have the same understanding. In other words, the moment that you establish a formula, you give it a name, the moment that everybody accepts that name, that's how the collective works. So when you're thinking about being in this department, when you're in the third tone or in the fourth tone, you have to see that don't get caught up in thinking that this is just the visual. It's not. It is the translation, the metamorphosis of the visual into the acoustic in order to impact on others. It's a bonding mechanism, and it's through the voice that our minds are linked in unison. That's the whole process. The linking of the global or the universal mind, if you will, that linking, all of that is coming out of these two tones. Now, obviously, we're going to see when we get to the fourth tone tomorrow, we're going to see that there is a difference in the way in which the abstract process functions, but the net result is the same. You get to the throat, and then you have to be able to articulate it. The whole thing about logic is if you don't have the right names, and if people don't share the same recognition of the right names, everything breaks down. Everything. So you've got to go through this process of establishing everything in a reasonable way. You always know that somebody trying to be logical. When they are unreasonable, you know there's a problem. And one of the things to be clear about the nature of the 60-second gate is that because it's a metamorphic gate, what it is really trying to do is that it's trying to fix that pattern at the same time that it's telling you that pattern. Let me put this another way. Memory and the way in which memory operates at the mind level. Every time that you take something in that's interesting for you and you put that back out into the world, you remember it. In other words, it's much easier for you to learn how to keep things, store things as memory. All you have to do is put them back out. Now think about all the things we've been describing. In other words, genetically we're designed to have enriched minds. Truly. Enriched minds. The only reason why we don't have enriched minds in that sense is because our minds are occupied in doing what they're not intended to do, which is run the life, which means that your mind is always occupied with concerns about why you did this or why you did that and what you're going to do and what you can't do. Endless energy being used by the mind when in fact all you have to do is listen to your basic strategy and honor that strategy, and mind goes back to doing what it does best, talking. And yet the more we share of our experience, the more we talk out of ourselves to the other, the more successful we are and the more secure the patterns are going to be. In other words, we need to share all of that information, that it is essential for us, and not to share that information in an environment where everybody is hearing what they want to hear. See, once you give something a name, it doesn't stop. Remember, there's no perfection. If you give somebody a name, you'll end up with a nickname. It never stops. It can't stop. And the moment you give somebody a name, there's going to be those that like it and don't like it. There's going to be those who want to use it and don't want to use it. I mean, one of the comedies in the world today is Myanmar. Or Myanmar, or Myanmar. Everybody was happy with Burma. Everybody was happy with Burma. It's like Zimbabwe. There were people who went along for 150 years and Rhodesia was fine. And all of a sudden you got a name change and it's a different country. What is Myanmar? I don't know. And it's a whole starting over. I mean, it's not like Burma disappeared. I mean, they're still there. They still make the best opium in the world and sell it to people. They're still there. But they got this new name and you don't know them anymore. What country is that? I don't know who these people are. See, the name business is a tricky business. And the moment that you have the majority that's going to stay with one name, you got problems. Remember in this country with Muhammad Ali. How funny that was to watch that played out as a melodrama in society. And the people that wanted to upset him, they wouldn't say his new name. Names have power. And we're going to argue over them because they do have power. That's the whole thing, after all. And who's going to be able to use that power? I mean, that's the business of logic. The 1762 is the channel of the organizational being. I mean, that's what it's about. And genetically, we're here to be organized through the Word. Organized through the Word. So this is the way it is, they will say to us. Now, it's often easier to accept that this is the way it is than this is the way it will be. Because we know that they're unreliable in terms of predicting how the future is going to operate. They can see the framework of a pattern and its movement, but they have no way of seeing how ultimately it can operate in time. They just don't have that. To see or not to see. For everything in design, there is a binary. For many, this can be the channel of the disorganizational being. Not being able to fit into the organization. Always having some chip on their shoulder about the way in which it operates, that it's not really the answer, that it's not really for them. And this is the basis of what we call schisms. And it's a very, very important attribute of the collective as it develops. In other words, schools of thought. Because it remains argumentative and because it's always looking for perfection, it will never accept any pattern just in the way that the pattern is. It can't. You know, forever people are going to be fucking around with human design. You know, I'd like to hang them all. You know, but what to do? You know, you can't stop that. That's human nature. You know, they're going to tinker and play and play. They will do all of those things. It's part of the logical process of affirming the knowledge, but it will always lead to schisms because logic is like that. We understand human design better than you. You know? I mean, there's always going to be those things, even when you're dealing with a logical process. Because you have to recognize that logic will always break down again and again and again into perfecting cells. Each cell trying to perfect it and make it better. Each cell challenging the authority of the source. I mean, that's how it works. That's what they do. On and on. You see, the vast majority of logical processes are not, like human design, revealed knowledge. If somebody, as part of their logical process, you know, is operating on the logical plane and bringing something into the logical plane, that is always the way that it's going to be dealt with, because it has to. It has to be challenged. And there will be different schools of thought. It is always going to be that way in terms of anything that's natural in the logical domain. It's the way our genes work. We try to get as much diversity as possible in order that when the next plague comes, or whatever it happens to be, that there's going to be some survivors in all of that. Schools of thought are like that. As a matter of fact, when you look at the works of Aristotle or Plato, you're actually getting the results of a school of thought that was one of many that circulated at that time, but their stuff happened to survive. In other words, you know, when the fire at Alexandria burned it all down, you know, some text left over from one of those schools of thought, that suddenly becomes, this is the source, you know. But of course it survived the plague. And who are we to judge, after all? It's the survivor. And so one of the things to see about the logical process is that it needs to keep on moving towards diversity. Now, this is the thing that's so disturbing to us, and one of the things that gives us this sense of our chaotic direction in life. In other words, when does all this diversity end? This is not about synthesis. This is not about seeing how everything flows into one. This is about how everything comes out of one. You know, so out of doctor, what do we have today? Thousands of variations on that theme. I mean, thousands of variations on that theme. And you've got this school of thought that's allotropic, and this school of thought that's homeopathic, and this school of thought that's just right down scalpel-like. You know, you got all these schools of thought. And it isn't to say that any one of them particularly is incorrect. It's all relative. We know that. However, they're always in tension with each other. My school's better than your school. You know, it's the way that it works. We can't afford to take all that personal. That's the fleshing out of logic. And of course, now we're living with the most intense fleshing out ever. Ever. Which means that it can be a little mind-boggling. You know, we've got so much stuff that's floating around now that we're dealing with, talking about, sharing, seeing, experiencing, in order to be able to get a grip on, you know, our place in the world right now. The Ajna Center is the pituitary system. And the pituitary glands, the anterior and the posterior pituitary, have enormous impact on the way in which our chemical, biological lives operate. They are, in fact, master glands in the endocrine system, and as master glands, they control the overall inner functioning of the body and its surface's interaction with the rest of the environment. Now, what the pituitaries do is that they release information, chemical information, that acts as a guide to, instructs. And basically what it's doing in language that we can appreciate is that it allows us to see what's going on and the interaction we have with the world around us. And it means that the way in which we see something impacts on our physical body. If every day of your life what you see is ugly, good luck. Because you're taking that in and you're holding that inside of you. Remember that, I don't know if you've got this yet, that it is the chemical things that we take in, these chemical things that we take in, that make such a difference for us. In other words, we do need the stimulation. We do need the variety. We do need to accept the place of the diversity. We need all of that. Yet at the same time, we can't afford to be fooled that any of it is safe for us, acceptable for us long term. We have to be able to argue about and be secure in whatever the pattern happens to be in the moment, because that's the thing that's so important to us. It's not about whether or not this is going to get to there, or whether this school of thought is right or wrong. Whatever school you're in the moment, as long as that's operating correctly for you, that's fine. But it's all about telling people, talking to them, arguing with them, dealing with them in that way. Now think about how perverse we are. Instead of doing that outside, which is the way we're intended to do that, we do it inside, to ourselves. We argue with ourselves. We tell ourselves we're not doing the right thing. No, I shouldn't have done that. That was a terrible thing to do. We tell ourselves when we're going to do it. Next week I'm leaving for la la la. We go to all that stuff and we take it all inside and we argue with ourselves and we really don't like it. Instead of putting it outside. It's that old cliche about everybody thinks that they're all alone. All alone in their problem, all alone with their difficulty, whatever it is. And of course, everybody on the block has the same thing. And that by opening that up and by communicating that, because that's what you see, that's the only way in which you're going to get the collective to get behind the bandwagon. I mean, after all, if you're at a political rally and you've got that 16 beating the drum, doesn't mean everybody's going to jump in line. It doesn't. Human beings at the collective level need to be impacted mentally. Mentally. They're not going to get carried away by, just the fact that there are banners there. They want to understand what's going on before they can get involved. The other side of that is that in the way it actually works most of the time, the 16 never gets a chance to do anything unless the 62 can actually build a good case for it. And in the world that we live in, with so many people living on the mental plane, these tones that are designed to operate through the mental frame, they can end up creating more problems than they solve. Simply because, the fact that you have this ability to be able to look and see the pattern, the assumption that you can do something about that you can live that pattern, act it out, follow it through. I mean, that's torture. Can't do that. What we can do is commune. You notice that when you go back and forth between people who know design and people who don't in terms of the way in which a conversation works and what exactly is communicated. I mean, the communication level is different. This isn't about better. This is just about different. It's essential to understand that when we're communicating with each other in a depersonal way, that we're enriching each other's lives and we're enriching the totality. It's the only thing we learn. It's the only way we truly learn anything. We learn it through the interaction with the other. And that's the whole point of all that. It's not about that person living out their own vision. It's not about that person getting caught up in their own mental trip. And it's not about creating a mental trip for other people. It's about establishing what is reasonable that somebody can trust. What is reasonable that somebody can see reasonably that it's reliable. I mean, it's the only concern of the logical mind. People going to school. There's so much of what they learn that's not reasonable, impractical, not of value. And they're not allowed to be trained argumentatively. There is not that essence that is there. What we've basically done is that we've provided a collective principle under tribal rule. In other words, that the teacher and the principal and these kinds of things, these are positions of power and authority. They must be obeyed. You're not allowed to shoot them, stuff like that. They're supposed to, and that is not the way logic operates successfully. It isn't. Oh, it's a way of keeping order, if you will. But that's not going to open up the proper kind of logical process. It's a hindrance to that logical process. The other thing is the importance of the expansion. They have done studies, and one of the things that's interesting is that when a child comes into the world, and it comes into the world with more than one language that it has to deal with, that it has a balance in the size of both lobes of the brain. And that there is a one single language area that develops that is 3 to 4 times larger than the language area in a person that's learning only one language when they're coming into the world. In other words, words for us are very important, and the vocabulary is very important, and the expansion of that vocabulary is essential. It always makes me laugh. There are people that I visit, and in their bathroom, they always have the Reader's Digest, which is really cute. My name is Jack and I'm your kidney, or, stuff like that. But they always have this wonderful array of words, to add to your vocabulary. And I thought, how quaint. I mean, People magazine doesn't do that, if you know what I mean. In other words, it's one of those things that's really good for us. The expansion of language, the expansion of our vocabulary is something that's healthy for our minds. It makes us better judges of the patterns that are there in the moment. And it means that if we're falling down in our ability to educate and keep our language healthy, and of course, this is a major thing that the collective is concerned about. The collective wants language to stay healthy, because if the language stays healthy, if the language isn't corrupted, if it doesn't break down, then you're going to be able to have the perfect tool. The perfect tool for the collective is the English language. This is the perfect tool. It's an insidious language. It's a whorehouse language. It doesn't matter, in English where a word comes from. You can say déjà vu, you can say angst. It doesn't matter what the root is. It doesn't matter who spoke it originally. It's suddenly English. And English takes in all of these words. The largest technical vocabulary in the world. 2 million technical words in English. 2 million technical words in English. So it's taken over the scientific world. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who resent the English language. But it is now the most common second language in the world. The collective loves it. See, if we can all be hung by the same note, it's perfect for the collective. We can say it in one language and everyone's going to understand. Now remember, if you lose your root, you got problems as a tribe. But the thing to see is that the collective, the major concern of the collective is that we get overwhelmed by a lingua franca. Now that is an old way. I mean, after all, in the throughout the first millennium, throughout most of the Western world and North Africa and parts of Asia and India, everybody spoke one language. They all spoke Latin. We did have a way of organizing society, and it was an incredible way of doing that. It was the greatest accomplishment of the Roman Empire, was to be able to communicate in one language to everybody across that entire spectrum. And of course, we have always had those kinds of languages and their roles. For a long time, for example, that was French, which was a political language that was used as the base language throughout the world. The French have never forgiven the English for usurping that position. Tough on the French, after all, they're the most arrogant race we've got, so let them stew a little bit in that, after all, they did create the world, so we have to give them some credit for that, or at least they, that's not true. Après moi le déluge, after me the flood, only a Frenchman can say that, eh? I don't mean to be dissing the French today. They just cropped up. Anyway, so there's a necessity in humanity to have a single language to communicate through. Now, this is the work of the 60-second gate. The 60-second gate is trying to create a way in which everybody can find the Aleph. The story of the Aleph. The story of the Aleph is that to look into the Aleph is to see all things at all times at once. In other words, the magical key. And everything about the 60-second gate is that magical key. It's that key that says if we can all tune into this, then we can all be one in this. One of the unique things about human design is that because there's terms that have never been in the language before, ever been in the language before, it has a very different kind of impact. Personality crystal, design crystal. These things have never been in the language. And of course, the moment that you see a mutation taking place is when there is a new word that comes into the language and it takes hold. And you can watch that. Watch how words come into a language. What you're looking at is, you're looking at something being added to the consistent pattern of the whole. And then it becomes acceptable. This is the whole business of naming things. It's all names. If you don't know the names, you're out of it. You got to know the names. You got to know how it works, and you got to have a name for it. And everybody's got to share that. You know what that's like to live out your design and people around you don't know what's going on. If you don't have the same names for things, design is based on a purity of its language. Everything has a name specifically. And yet many of those names are different when you see them in the context of society. The way we use fate and karma and destiny as simply terms of geometry rather than moralistic equations. And until you have commonality in the way in which you have definition, in other words, the way you define a name, only then do you have a bond that's truly made, that is not easily ever broken.